So, are we going to address how we basically keep getting scooped every topic that we want to spend like some deep long drawn out conversation on? We find, some episode just gets released like 2 weeks before we're going to do it.
Yeah, or people are writing up articles and things like that that are talking about what we're talking about, but they're not giving us credit.
People have the nerve to have ideas independently of us and release them around the same time.
I suspect that there's moles afoot.
It's like an old producer leaves and then suddenly all this content starts getting released. Look, it's just suspicious is all I'm saying.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Welcome, everybody, to this part 2 episode of the Voyage podcast, where Jacob and I are going to continue our conversation, not totally in a different direction. Again, we try to go a little bit deeper with a lot of these things. We covered a lot of the basic kind of foundational stories for where do we see magic rings and what's the role or what's the importance of magic rings. And we started to tie it into and connect it to a little bit of the theology with it because as we talked about, it all kind of centers around this idea or wraps itself around in this idea of religio or binding.
Ayo.
And so where we get the word religion is from religio, and it's this concept of binding. What are we being bound to, and how the role of binding is so integral to all of these magic ring stories, whether it's for good or for bad. I think mostly it's usually, maybe I don't know if you can say mostly for good or for bad. It's probably pretty neutral in that sense.
Well, so here's where I think, and I think this is just the nature of like the conversations kind of going where they go kind of thing, regardless of what your outline is trying to do. Well, regardless of what the shackles of your outline is trying to put me in. What
Check that one off the bingo card.
That your outline, is
Jacob
trying to put me in.
denigrates the outline. Let's check that off the bingo card. All right, sorry, continue.
Basically kind of where my interest lies within the context of this conversation is the idea that because if we're just talking about binding, um, that can still be construed as this kind of like mental construct or this kind of propositional statement, right? But what I like about talking about this in the context of a
Mhm.
physical object, like a ring, right? Is you're tying it to the idea that this isn't just some kind of like philosophical program or some kind of like mental acquiescence or something
Well,
like that or devotion. It's actually we're we're tethered to things within this kind of physical
and
reality that we live in, and the objects that we engage with play a
Well,
role
and you
in
use the word symbol
how we
before.
are
You've
bound.
talked about how symbol, it's not supposed to be
Absolutely.
a stand-in for fake. In fact, that totally misunderstands what the concept of symbol, even the original word, is supposed to be. Like you said, the symbol is supposed to be the
Hmm.
thing that brings together or symbolon.
Yep.
And so
It's the Venn diagram. It's the center of the
and
Venn
so
diagram, folks. It's
so
it's
the when we
real.
talk about the ring as a symbol, right? It's not a stand-in for the reality. It's the thing that makes the reality more visible. Right. And we've had some
And I think
conversations
that
about
so
sacraments.
let's
That actually is making me think of our conversation about sacraments too. But
well, absolutely. And we were getting there. I mean, honestly, by the end of our last conversation when we were talking about the
yeah,
Horcruxes and all that stuff, it took a very sacramental um vibe, which is it's the thing that
well, and
I'm
I
most
think that's what's
passionate
so
about.
clever too. Going
Um
back to the Horcruxes, like you said, is in one sense it's inverting that symbolon because what does the Horcrux do? But it divides the soul, and so it's just makes it such a clever,
mhm,
I guess, object in the story.
yeah, it's like an
Oh,
anti-sacrament.
s-
But,
hey, did you just come up with it?
anti-sacrament doesn't mean
Go back. Refer to episode part 1 of this conversation.
yeah, right. Um, but and so again, anti-sacrament doesn't mean that it's still not using the same mechanism, right? Like the Antichrist, for example, doesn't mean like the he's still going to come as someone who, or people who are antichrist even
They'll
now,
do the
right?
things that
Are
Christ
people
does,
who
but
put
like,
on the
they'll
facade.
look a lot like
Yeah.
it. That's what makes it so enticing.
They act like Christ, but they're not
And-
exactly, right? So this idea of anti-sacraments, or demonosis, again, refer to episode 1. It's the same process. It's just it's doing the opposite of what the process should be doing. But
well, where I think you were going, Jacob, and this is a recovery end. No, so you wanted to talk more about, and this is why, because originally we weren't even thinking we would do a part 2, at least not right away, but we wanted to follow up.
We just ran out of time
because we, and it's been a while. We haven't really talked a ton about comic books as much. It's been a lot of, whether it's like literature or mythology, things like that, which of course comic books are going to be influenced by, but an explicit comic book character, you were thinking, oh, Green Lantern, rings. Yeah.
Our corporate overlords do specialize.
We had a production meet, and we were,
ironically enough.
So we were reprimanded thoroughly. But we now we can say that
when I stood before the council of elders at Voyage Comics.
But we love Big Brother, and so we've been.
That's
and
right.
So we wanted to do a comic book. We wanted to talk more about, because where do we see rings in comics, especially, that's the Green Lantern, right? And what's great about it is,
let's not keep teasing them. We're going to talk Green Lantern, one of my favorite comic book
and what I love
heroes.
about that, because it's not like it's convenient for us because Green Lantern has a ring. Go back to all the things we talked about in part 1.
That is fundamentally, isn't that true though, Mike? We're basically talking about Green Lantern because it's just another ring example. But I will salvage your mediocrity and fill it with depth.
Yeah.
Because I can bring that. This conversation.
Might as well start now, right? So what's great though is that it does reiterate so many of the things, the foundational things that we talked about when we talked about binding, the ring as a symbol for binding, but also when we were talking about the rings of power and how that binding or that unifying force will have a power to it, or that you're beholden to a power, right? When we think of binding and loosing, like Jesus talks about in the Gospels. And I think the power and the binding, I think, are the two biggest ones that I at least can think of when we talk about, what are some of the things that you can associate when it comes to whether it's the Green Lantern Corps or any of the iterations of the Green Lantern characters or whatever?
Well, let me just get into, I think the easiest thing for me to do is just kind of give a little synopsis of who the Green Lantern is and what makes him an interesting character to such an extent that he's one of my personal favorites, right? The Green Lanterns are actually a corps, the Green Lantern Corps, and they are cosmic police officers that they all have a quadrant or a section of the universe, and their home base is the planet Oa, and there they have a council who, much like our corporate overlords, are blue-skinned and have white hair.
You've said too much.
And and they go and basically were the originators, the progenitors of the I guess what you'd call it, like the lantern system or whatever, where they have like these lanterns, and depending upon what time frame you're referring to, they charge up their rings with like the lanterns they got. It's kind of like the source of their power. So there's actually many Green Lanterns, right? But the Green Lantern that we frequently refer to is the one that's in charge of like the Earth sector, and probably the most famous Green Lantern is Hal Jordan. It's kind of like the penultimate Green Lantern. But that
was the first one that came to my mind too. So
yeah, Hal Jordan is kind of the go-to Green Lantern. But there's huge fan favorites and a long history. So like Jon Stewart, and Guy Gardner, and Kyle Rayner. I couldn't think that guy's name for some reason. Kyle Rayner. He was the one that was introduced in the 90s.
And what's what's great about it is, like you said, they're all united. They all kind of share this idea of they're part of this Green Lantern Corps. And so in one sense, yeah, they're different iterations and they all have their own kind of like unique quirks or whatever. Go back to our idea of binding or unity. They're not just united by they all happen to be wearing this ring. But one of the first things that I remember when thinking of the Green Lantern character or the Green Lantern comic is the oath, right? They take that.
Well, that's actually just where I was
Is
about
that
to go
right?
up to, is like the oath, because but as a matter of fact, it's true, Mike. Just because, and what I was gonna say is, one of the things that these you think about the Lord of the
Yeah.
Rings, right? And the ring, and everyone thinks of like the poem, that's so famous related to it. In the darkness
Mhm.
bind them stuff. Well, the Green Lanterns have their own little statement, their own little code, which is really sick. I will go ahead. I Googled it because I don't want to
Yeah.
mess it up like I do so many other things. But in brightest day and blackest night, no evil shall escape my sight. Let those who worship evil's might beware my power. Green Lantern's light.
Ooh.
And so the other thing
Chills.
about these Green
Chills right
Lanterns
now.
that we should, yes, isn't it? Did you like my
Mhm.
oratory? I wasn't sure to fully commit or not, so I didn't. Next time I'll give it like a Shakespearean auteur. But the the thing about Green Lanterns that makes them a super interesting concept, especially for us, is the relationship to
Mhm.
light itself, right? And also
Yeah.
willpower. So just to go into a little bit more of like the mythos of the Green Lanterns for the context of this conversation, is there's actually a spectrum of light, and the light spectrum, and it correlates to our Roy G. Biv. I'm a graphic designer. Um, spectrum, where the colors of the rainbow, basically, right? And each of those colors correlates to a different emotion,
Mhm.
basically, or psychic element, actually. So it's because it's not actually all emotions. But red is anger,
Yeah.
surprise, surprise. Green is willpower. Yellow is
Hmm.
fear. But then you have things like blue. Blue is hope. Or pink or violet is like passion or
Okay.
lust or love, right? Um, which one did I miss? Well, anyway, you get the idea. They all correlate to different things. And like so something like hope or willpower are not actually
No, that is
emotions per
interesting
se,
that it
right?
kind
But they
of
are kind of
like
these
you
psychic
you
elements
look for
though.
some sort of like trend in all of them. You're like, well, in one sense, it seems to like jump around or whatever. Which, okay, fine. It serves the purposes of the of the writers or whatever world they want to build. Which is again, we can at least suspend our whatever criticism or something for that. But so what's the significance though of the green and willpower one?
I I actually I don't have a good answer for you on that one. I'm pretty sure that they were just making it up
Okay.
as they went. Like I think because honestly this goes back to like the 40s with the Silver Age Green Lantern. I won't be able to think of that guy's name off the top of my head either. He was a completely different type of Green Lantern, though. He was actually a magic
Okay.
user, and like he had a magic lantern or whatever. But eventually, so that's Golden Age. But then in the Silver Age, they transform it into this alien. Abin Sur is the person that Hal Jordan takes his place because he crash lands
Yeah,
on
I can
Earth and
remember that. Yeah.
dies, and then the ring, yeah, chooses Hal Jordan. So to get into, and the reason why I'm spending so much time going into all the lore around Green Lantern is because all of it is super fascinating for this entire conversation we're having about binding
Well,
and about rings
even
and
the
about
language that you just
sacraments
used in
and
the origin
stuff.
story, because you talked about how the ring, chose the hero, so to speak. And
Yeah,
it's like
absolutely.
how many times in the Lord of the Rings does Gandalf refer to the ring as having a will of its own, right? Whether it's a
Yep.
will that seeks to find someone or to leave somebody, right? They talk about how the ring betrayed Isildur, leading to his death, how the ring wanted to be found by Bilbo because it wanted to return to its master. Now, it didn't anticipate that, all the circumstances that would lead to its destruction. But the more important thing is to go back to what you're saying about um you have this, Green Lantern Corps member who crash lands, like you said, right before he dies, or in the circumstances surrounding his death leads to the ring choosing the next one.
So here's the thing: the Green Lantern Corps, right? Let's just think about what we're describing here. Now, don't get me wrong, the comic storylines, they go lots of different places, and sometimes they impugn the guardians of Oa, like the counselor people who created the Green Lantern Corps, as being sinister. Like depending upon like who the author is. Oftentimes the guardians are this kind of
that's
bureaucratic,
kind of typical too, like
curmudgeonly
deconstruction
nightmare
of
kind of thing.
authority kind of thing, where it's like, oh, the good guys aren't who you
Right.
think they are. So
Exactly.
that's not, I mean, in one sense, that's par for the course.
It's not unusual
Yeah.
for that to be the case. But if we ignore the proclivity for modern writers to like to deconstruct things and things like that, what you have is this cosmic transcendent force represented by a crew of people, right? And there's never that many of them. I mean, it might be 12, right? I don't think it's 12, but like it's just it's a handful of people, and they go and they spread this power through the universe, and then the people in the universe go and take that power, and that power is the power of light, and it's the power of will, and they use it to fight evil as their code. It's no evil shall escape my sight. Let those who worship evils might beware my power. Green Lantern's light, and they even use the language
Yeah, that
worship
is
evil,
interesting.
right? Which is kind of theologically loaded language. And they go and it's all about conquering fear. Like the primary the big
Sinestro, right?
bad,
Yeah.
is Sinestro, yeah. It's funny early, you always have to have this origin story for Hal Jordan where Sinestro is still a member of the Green Lantern Corps, but his name's
So you
Sinestro.
almost think, yeah, it's
So
written in the
it's like
stars, so to speak.
there's he was dual
Oh,
predestination. He was
nice.
destined
Yeah.
for yeah. But anyway, Sinestro becomes he was so and this plays into a Lord of the Rings concept where Sinestro wanted to wield the power of the ring in order to like conquer people.
Hmm.
Because and that doesn't work, and so he ends up going
Well,
to
and that
fear. He
it
ends
actually kind
up
of ties in what
morphing
you're
into
saying
the
about how the green is with willpower, and it's like willpower in and of itself can be used for, like, you can have an evil will or a will that is like corrupted or disordered. And so we kind of see, like you
Yep.
were saying, you have this guy who he's originally part of the quote unquote good guys, and because of his will to power, to use another kind of loaded phrase, um, that's what kind of makes
Mhm.
him or corrupts him or makes him mad, which that's very much has Melkor Sauron overtones to it, doesn't it?
It does. He basically takes this Machiavellian route where it's better to be feared than loved, right? And we could have a whole conversation
Mhm.
about that, but that's where he goes, and so he becomes the champion of fear,
Mhm.
kind of thing. And so, what I want to point out to you at this point is that the we say willpower, right? Willpower is the language that the comics use, that the Green Lantern use, all that stuff, right? But in practice, what willpower means when you just watch any show or read any comic book about what willpower seems to mean when it comes to how the Green Lanterns use it is it basically comes down to a matter of like
Okay.
belief. It comes down to a matter of faith. It comes down to like I believe I'm strong enough to do this. I can
Well,
overcome this.
and is it
I
ordered
can
towards
will this
something
to be
outside of
true.
yourself, or is it completely like, ordered inward or turned inward? And this kind of goes back to,
Yeah.
if you remember, the Ring of Gyges, where, remember in that story, the guy has this ring that makes him invisible, and it's not that he is unbound; it's that now he is bound to an even more a crueler taskmaster of his own passions. And so it's the same thing when we talk
Mhm.
about the green ring in, or the ring in Green Lantern, is, yeah, where's your will ordered? Is it ordered outside of
Yeah.
yourself, or is it totally inward, like you were saying with Sinestro's character?
Well, and so like in the purpose of the Green Lanterns is basically to promote justice, right? And from a Christian perspective, justice is going to mean like holy order,
Mhm.
hierarchy, basically. And I don't mean that in like a tyrannical sense. Just like we think hierarchy is only a reference to like organizational like ladder, you going up and down the organizational pipeline
Yeah.
or something like that. But no, it's a much broader concept of just peace, of everything being aligned, everything being in its proper place, everything working synergistically with each other, and cultivated in a way that there's no
Actually,
friction,
the
right?
when you're talking about the
Um,
relationship between justice and hierarchy, it reminded me of did you ever read Dante's Divine Comedy, in his section on, or in the Paradiso, when he goes through the heavenly spheres, and he has one dedicated to
Hmm.
the virtue of justice. But he has this, there's a little bit of a reflection of hierarchy throughout that whole, I mean, the whole thing is like the whole Divine Comedy, whether he's going through Inferno, Purgatorio,
Sure.
or Paradiso, it's all about hierarchy because he's medieval, right? He's scholastic.
Right.
So the
Yeah.
scholastics, they were all about hierarchy.
Well, and and I would say that this is true of any classical Christian
Yeah.
tradition, right? Modern Christianity really is influenced by forces outside of
The
the historic
flattening
church,
out
right?
too.
But the historic church is a friend,
Flattening out.
huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very democratic, quote unquote, right? Just flattening everything kind of thing. And that has problems as far as I'm concerned. I think that leads to cultural friction as we see it. We talked about this a little bit in the mimetic episodes
Yeah.
with Renee Girard when we were talking about envy and how social media causes us to feel like we should have the same lifestyle as everybody else because we have this kind of democratic ideology that
It gives this
pushes
illusion
us,
of
this
level
democratic
playing
passion.
field. It's still an illusion, but
Right.
it's a very convincing
How
one.
come my life isn't
Yeah.
exactly like this other person's life, right? So anyway, but so these when we're talking about how the different lanterns represent different like psychic realities, right? The red lanterns are obviously they're just angry all the time, but so some of these literally feel like passions embodied,
Yeah.
right? So the red lanterns are obviously anger, right? But then the star sapphires are the pink ones, right? And start they so for one, all of these rings have this possessive quality. And it's an interesting, it kind of breaks down the analogy a little bit. But it just depends upon what case study you're looking at. Because when it comes to the Green Lanterns, it's very much that there's this kind of synergy that's taken place between the wearer of the ring. Because they can reject. So Hal Jordan could have rejected being a
Sure.
Green Lantern. The the Guardians aren't going to make you like enslave you into being a Green Lantern. But that being said, you're always chosen. Kind of like what we were just talking about a couple minutes ago. Like Hal Jordan is whisked away. He's basically kidnapped by the ring and brought to the
Well, that
planet
kind of makes me
Oa.
think of the
And
rings in
there-
Magician's Nephew, how it was just like touching it brought you to this wood between the worlds too. So that, I mean, but
Yeah,
anyway,
you're
sorry
right about that.
Yeah, keep going.
No, you're right. But so in the sense that they are a binding agent, like you are chosen and bound to, and then there you're able to take the oath,
Yeah.
right? And then you bind yourself to this oath to fight evil. And then you serve this cosmic order that's and it really is like a monastic order almost. Police force is kind of like the analogy that people are always using. And that's true. They're like space police,
Okay.
basically. But it's just as much like you could think of it as like an order in that regard, that you bind yourself to an oath and you wear this ring
Like a Knights
as
Templar sort of thing. I was thinking.
symbol.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so Emerald Knights are actually a phrase that can be used to refer to these people, right? So there is that kind of knightly crusader aspect to these people. So all of it, like, it's just such a rich mythology. And especially if you look at these things from a Christian lens, you just see all these parallels for being able to put yourself in the shoes of like a crusade against evil, right? And being bound to a system that's fighting it and things like that.
Well, and the thing that like,
but,
one of the things that we could probably keep going back to this, almost like a disclaimer for anything that we talk about, is because almost 99% of these, whatever we're going to be talking about, whether it's comics, movies, TV shows, examples in pop culture, they weren't written with this like explicit Christian message in mind. It wasn't because that would make it bad art. It would make it propaganda. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to try to look at so many of these things beyond just the level of, well, good guys represent, the Christians or the virtues or the angels, and the bad guys represent the bad guys or the pagans or the devils or whatever. And so when we're talking about, the ring specifically, how it's like, it's not supposed to be this allegory for like, okay, is it this sacrament, or is it the sacraments in general, or is it this, analog to Christianity or whatever? It is going into kind of on the human level, right? And this is why connecting it with willpower is so important, is it's that binding thing again. Even though you choose it, right? Like you said before, it's not like you are enslaved by it necessarily, because that's the thing, is like
You have to work with it.
You still freely take the oath, right? Now, him being transported to this place, maybe that was like manipulation, or maybe that strongly encouraged him to take it or whatever. But I mean, it's not like, Hal Jordan was quote unquote chosen for a reason too. He was like this, brave, heroic fighter pilot, right?
That's exactly right. Like the man without fear kind of thing.
So he had,
no offense,
and actually
Daredevil.
using that
But,
is kind of nice for Green Lantern, because obviously he fights Sinestro as kind of like the main. So yeah.
Well, that is, I didn't make that up.
Well, the man without fear
that
is
is kind
Daredevil,
of his shtick.
yeah.
That is Daredevil. It is, but it's also something that is applied to Hal Jordan. But any of these, I just realized I never finished the idea that some of these things that they fight are basically like map onto passions, right? Because where I was going was the Starfires. That's his girlfriend. Iris West. That's Flash's girlfriend. Anyway, can't think of her name right now either. Too many names, people.
Yeah.
Sorry. But she gets chosen by the Star Sapphire ring, but that is unlike Hal Jordan. That's like against her will or against her acquiescence. She doesn't like when she becomes Star Sapphire. That's like a Jekyll and Hyde.
But like you said, that
transformation.
one,
and she's no longer in control of
but
what
like
she's
you even
doing.
said, that one is the one that's more ordered by passions. And so that would kind of make sense.
It is,
that
yeah.
like
So the Red Lanterns, so there's like bad lanterns, right? Like Red Lanterns are anger and they're bad guys, and Star Sapphires are bad guys basically. And it's funny because they're like, Star Sapphire can be something of a anti-hero as well. It's almost like our concept of fairies, where they can be almost amoral. And it's like, if you want to get into a conversation about how love can be both positive and destructive.
Well, and I think
depending upon what
in the same way that we talked about,
right?
Sinestro was originally, a good guy, or he was originally the Green Ring, or like he had the Green Ring. So like, in the same way that willpower can be used towards positive and negative, so too can the passions. Like the ancient Christian teaching has never been that passions are automatically bad. Christianity isn't stoicism. And so I think, it opens up to that. It's just a bigger view of reality when you're talking about whether it's one specific character or just the order of, green, yellow, pink, whatever.
Well, and to your points, there was this massive crossover event in the 2000s, which is one of the coolest crossover events ever. It was called Darkest Night. And it was basically the DC zombie apocalypse. But it was rooted in the mythology of the Green Lanterns. And so it turns out that Brightest Day, Blackest Night, no evil shall escape my sight, that's actually a prophecy. And the Blackest Night prophecy was that there was going to be a Black Lantern. This Black Lantern was going to arise, and he was going to have the power of death. And he was going to bring back all the people, like basically zombies, and they all get Black Lantern rings, right? And so you have a Black Lantern core that arises, and it's the power of death, right? And so, but here's the thing: in order to fight off the Blackest Night and win the day in that event, all of the rings have to come together. So the red, yellow,
Captain
even
Planet
the
situation.
bad guy, it's a Captain Planet. That is true. That's literally true. And not only is it like Captain Planet, which we gotta talk about Captain Planet now, man, for sure.
I actually took that one off the outline.
How did we? Oh no, we gotta bring it back. We'll get to it. But they form together and they create the White Lantern Corps. which is kind of a nice play on the idea, like the prism, all the colors.
It's
white
the singularity,
is
or it's the or it's
singularity,
divine simplicity, if you want to go classical
There you
theism
go.
on it.
Well, and it's just your point. So, like, the passions aren't inherently bad. It's just that they can be disordered, and they tend to disorder. And but in that case, they all have to come together, Captain Planet style, to fight off the bad
That,
guys,
I mean,
kind of thing,
that
and
is
destroy
actually
death.
like you
Right? Fight
said,
death.
the not just that white is the opposite of black, and it's the kind of classic like Western white hat versus black hat, but that it's because it's almost like a reversal of the, usually when we think of like the prism, it's the white light breaking into all the colors, but here
Dark Side of the Moon, baby. One of the best albums
here
ever.
they're uniting and returning back to that unity, right? Or that simplicity of
Mhm.
the white light. But even, if you want to make this really kind of philosophical or theological too, is there's all that latent like potential in the white that can break into and become all those different colors, right? And so there's that infinite number of
Mhm.
possibilities, which, even as you said, for simplicity's sake, you only have the Roy G. Biv, but you almost think of like you said, as a graphic designer, well, there's 85% red and then there's 86% red or whatever. So it's like you've got, or there's 85.11% and then 85.12%. And so you have this like infinite spectrum that it can break into.
You know what's funny? So you can see like kind of the richness of this mythology in the Green Lantern Corps, and frankly, in a way that I think supersedes most other heroes. Right? I mean, like, there's just so much. I know we didn't plan on, in a better world, we would just have like a Green Lantern episode, and this
Or
is
a
kind of
Green
turning
Lantern
into a Green
3-part
Lantern
like
episode
Batman.
because
Like,
you could. I
not
mean, you
today.
totally could.
Not today.
Yeah, but not today. Not today. We haven't even talked about what Green Lanterns do, as in like what their superpower is, which is fascinating that we spent this long talking about it. And we
Well,
haven't even
and I
gotten to
guess
like what
we're
drew
kind
me
of
to Green Lantern
assuming
to
we're kind of
begin
assuming a
with
lot of
is
stuff when it comes to like, okay, fine, the
yeah,
ring can produce any sort of like power that comes from the person's thought or the person's will, right?
yeah,
And which
constructs.
there again, there's a
So they can manifest these constructs, these realities
yeah.
through
So
their
if
will,
he
right?
imagines, so
Through
to
their
speak, a big fist to punch somebody, or something like that.
or a big fly
Okay,
swatter,
yeah. So
fly swatters, classic
which there again, just
hammer,
to go back
big
to our
hammer.
big our big it is a comic book, so it has to get a little cartoonish, right?
Yeah,
A big anvil falling from the sky.
it's always yeah, I always look for, I'm always judging a Green Lantern author on the creativity of the constructs that they end up
Okay.
manifesting. So let that be a warning to all you
Yeah,
Green Lantern
all the
authors
Green
out
Lantern,
there.
all the
Get creative, man. He can make up anything he wants.
it kind of reminds me of
enough
I
fly
always remember
swatters.
the Captain Caveman, where he would pull stuff out of his beard. Are you familiar with that? But
Oh,
instead of
sure.
pulling a flashlight out of his beard, he pulls a
Captain
he pulls a dinosaur holding a flashlight. So it's just like an unnecessary extra. And so you think of like, yeah, how unnecessarily extra can the Green Lantern's, imagination get when making some.
Oh, you want to know what's all right, so you want to know what's cool also, and this plays really, really well into a Christian idea of how the church works. Because, all right, obviously what I was getting at earlier is that the Green Lantern Corps is kind of like the church. And it's kind of like this cosmic force for good, that is ordained and led by a council of elders, and that goes out into the universe and
Okay.
fights evil, right? With willpower and with light.
Well, and there's kind of a
And,
grace of nature thing going on,
but
but yeah, go ahead.
and but each lantern, he doesn't lose his personality in the manifestation of his constructs, and the manifestation of like what he
Okay.
does. So what that looks like is, so I labeled off a number of different Green Lanterns, right? So Guy Gardner is a hothead, and so his constructs are like brute
Okay.
force. Like, that's just where his brain goes. In other words, the constructs that Green Lanterns manifest reflect their
Sure.
personalities. And Kyle Rayner is a graphic designer. Yay. He's not my favorite, ironically. But or was he a comic book artist?
Oh, that's
Maybe it
that's
was
like
both.
that's
I
like
don't
that
know.
meme of you know the meme of Obama where he puts the medal on somebody, but it's Obama, so it's like giving a award to yourself. That's like that meme. Yeah.
No, I do think it was actually kind of like that. But he's an artist. All right, we'll just say he's an artist. But so anyway, his creations tend to be artistic and creative and things like that. And then John Stewart, he's a military guy. He's a soldier, and so all of his constructs are. It's implied that they stem from like a soldier's mentality, right? Where they might be kind of militaristic or kind of strategic. Um, mission-based constructs and things like that. And Hal Jordan, he's kind of like the Dick Grayson in the sense that he's like the well-rounded one, like the kind of penultimate one. But so it's cool though that the way these rings work is they take the will of the person and manifest it in reality, right? And if that person is an artist, then what's going to manifest in reality is going to be more artistic than what the soldier manifests, or what the hothead
And I think
manifests,
going
and
back
things like
to
that.
so when we keep talking about this idea of rings and binding and how in the same way that we never really get to see it in the Lord of the Rings, but how each person, it would affect each wearer differently, right? It would affect a hobbit differently than it would affect a man of Numenor, or it would affect a Gandalf, or it would affect an elf or whatever.
Yeah,
And
you're
so
right.
in the same way, these rings, even though they're all green, so to speak, they all are still unique reflections of the wearer. And so, and your power is it's an extension of you. And so it connects that, that thing, that power that you wanted to manifest, to use your word, it's extending out further, right? It's more powerful, but it is still bound to you, or bound to your imagination, or bound to your personality, like you were saying with the each of the unique Green Lanterns. And it's kind of like, to kind of bring this full circle, like that's one of the things about when we talk about religio as binding, right? We immediately think of binding as slavery, but it was supposed to be, again, go back to our,
or like a wedding
Yeah.
ring. A wedding ring
yet-
is
the old ball and
you're
chain,
shackled,
right?
your ball and
And yet
chain.
that's what frees
right?
the person to love in a much deeper way than that person ever could have done on his own or on her own. You actually buy that binding,
Right.
and what do you do when you get the ring? You take an oath, right? Just like the Green Lantern, they take that oath. And so it's in
Absolutely.
that binding of yourself.
So it's very sacramental ultimately.
It's in, and well, even the
You
whole
know?
idea of like charging it up, it kind of made me think of like grace again, but
Mhm.
it's very much this idea of religio and binding, where it's not a question of if you're going to be bound, it's what you're going to be bound to. And is that binding of yourself, like you said with the Green Lantern? Yeah, he had to take that oath. He was free to reject it, but that's what enabled him or empowered him to kind of like live out the heroic qualities that were already part of him. That's why I said it was kind of the nature and grace thing too, right? By nature, he had a lot of these natural virtues, but it was the grace, or this extrinsic, power of the ring, that allowed him to be the comic book hero, so to speak. And
Well, and so some of the things that we talked about last time was basically we you have to bind yourself to something, right? And I think that we think that like freedom is such um a ideology across all political spectrums, right? Like Americans are a freedom loving culture, and I'm one of those people, right? 100%. I am a dyed in the wool freedom loving, you know, guy, right? Um, but that mitigates against the sense that you're supposed to bind yourself to a purpose, a higher purpose.
yeah, it's not freedom from, it's freedom for, right? What is it ordered towards?
Yeah, freedom for, exactly, right. And I think that was 100% in the minds of like our founding fathers. I think that that was the idea that was driving the revolutionary generation at the beginning
Because
of this country.
you,
And then, like I think we said,
you still had a sense of virtue.
it turns
right?
into
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, absolutely. It was still no, you're fine. it turns into freedom from, like you said, from freedom for to like freedom to do whatever I want kind of thing. Freedom from restriction. And that's when things start to dissolve. That's when things start to get diabolic and break apart.
Well, because
right?
if you like you're deluded if you think it's untethered. So now you're in a state where you just don't know what you're tethered to. Again, it's the ring of Gyges. It's now that he's untethered by society, which this isn't saying that every rule society has is automatically right, but it's just knowing what you're going to be bound to. And that character, he knew that he was unbound by the rules of his community. He didn't realize that he was being bound to his passions. And that's what Socrates that's what Socrates was trying to point out. And it's what, when we talk about, oh, I'm not going to be bound to this other person, and you just reject the whole concept of marriage. Okay, you're untethered there, but what are you now tethered to? What's your alternative, right? You're free from that thing,
Right.
but what are you free for, so to speak?
Yep, absolutely. Well, and this does it goes back to our conversation that we were talking about in the Matrix and things like that, actually, where the choice, Neo's like, I don't like the idea that I'm not in control, right? Which is that like my will doesn't matter, that my will doesn't mean anything. And the idea behind him breaking out of the Matrix is that he can participate in the truth, right? First and foremost, but then also actually bind himself to what he chooses to bind himself to, instead of just being a slave to that which is pushing him, i.e. the Matrix, this enslavement to reality, right?
He had to rage against that machine.
And that he sure did, man. When I was having my little crisis of faith in my early 30s and things like that, like I said in that Matrix episode, what I realized is that the things that were driving me away from God, pushing me away from God, it was not rooted in logic. It wasn't rooted in arguments. It was rooted in a lack of will, right? To go back to the Green Lantern analogy, why willpower is so important for the Green Lanterns. It's all about free will. It's all about choice. And to not be confined or stuck with the circumstances that are given you, kind of thing, but to participate, to actively choose what your commitment is to, what you bind yourself to, instead of just being bound to something because you were born into it.
For kind of our last little segment, this is where it gets actually theological. You ready? This is why we've talked about so much and how, it's just like marriage. It's just like sacraments. And it's like, yeah, that's why in both of our traditions, marriage is a sacrament. I think we're the only two Christian traditions, Catholic and Orthodox, that actually recognize marriage specifically as a sacrament.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, is what Anglicans and Episcopalians?
I don't
and
think
Lutherans,
it's.
They don't.
Yeah, I don't. It's not a I mean, obviously they have it,
or it might not be the same heavy. Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. Lutherans, they tend to talk about baptism and Eucharist.
Yeah, I don't think
they,
so. But even if
shame
that were
on
the
me,
case,
I was raised Lutheran,
even if that were the case, we both know that even the differences amongst Catholic and Orthodox in terms of what makes a sacrament, and that alludes to a fun private conversation you and I have been having, even recognizing those, they're still much closer than the differences between, historic Christianity and more modern Christianity when it comes to even what is a sacrament, much less if you include marriage as one. But anyway, all of this stuff, when we're talking about like rings and binding, this all stems from, this is like just consistent with how God has operated throughout the entire Old Testament and New Testament in terms of, talking about binding. We talked about Jesus, binding and loosing, or where does binding show up when it comes to sacrifice? Where does it show up when it comes to religious authority and things like that? But specifically marriage, the binding of marriage becomes that model for the binding of religion, the binding of our relationship with God, right? That's why, what's the image that God uses for Israel? Whether we're talking the prophet Hosea and his wife, or Moses and the people of Israel when he's taking them out of Egypt, is he uses marriage. He uses marital language. What is the image that Jesus
Yep.
uses in so many of his parables? He calls himself the bridegroom and the church the bride. What is,
This is a big
yeah.
deal. The idea that marriage is almost a symbol or an icon par excellence for God's relationship to
Mhm.
humans and Jesus's relationship to his church, right? Should give us pause. Um, because nowadays we think that marriage just means that, like, when two people like each other a lot and love each other, then they get to choose to be together kind of thing. And on the one hand, credit where credit's due, there's still a sense that you're making a public proclamation and you're binding yourself to another person, right? And that's admirable, right?
But it's
There's
not,
nothing
it doesn't have
wrong with
something
that.
outside of
But
yourselves. It's still within the, yeah.
it's not something that God's
Mhm.
performing. It's not something that you're organizing, and it's not, if it's not an icon, a cosmic level icon of God's relationship to humanity and reality itself, then it's not participating in the symbol of it, right? It's just another kind of
Well, and
consumptive
even, and it's
act.
not even about, oh, it has to extend beyond the two, because even he said, oh, well, society, protects marriage, or the government protects marriage. That still is confined to humanity. It's still confined to creation. Whereas the whole Christian concept, the ancient Christian concept, whether we're talking Catholic or Orthodox, is that because it's a sacrament, it goes beyond creation, right? It's not just that it's like God is giving his thumbs up about it. It's that it was implanted in our nature, right? And so like our nature, yeah.
And God is acting in it. God is
Mm-hmm.
acting in it, right? Like it's God's tool for us, right? And I sometimes I wonder if we don't forget that sacraments are things that God does,
Mm-hmm.
and like he does it with humans, through humans, in humans, right? Like synergy is a term is actually a theological term that the Orthodox Church uses, but I'm sure the Catholic Church either uses
An
it or
analog,
has
yeah.
its same basic concept of it. Yeah. Um, it's synergistic though, that it's participatory in each other, but it's something that God gives us and we
Mm-hmm.
respond to it. Right. But it's fundamentally an act done by God. Um, when we say that sacraments are full of grace, right? Regardless of the whole conversation we could have about what grace is and things like that, it's still fundamentally it's full of grace because it's God's action, because it's God's
Well,
um
and again, they're
God is
the
filling it with
symbol of
grace,
it, not symbol
right?
in terms of replacement of the real, but it's the thing that binds us to that invisible or intangible reality. Which, going back to you're talking about grace, it's like the physical
Hmm.
object, whether it's the bread and wine, the oil, the water, the two people in marriage. That's what binds us to that grace. Again, keep using
Yep.
binding.
Well, and so this is why, and we'll get into this. I want to do a whole episode just on magic, right? I think I've mentioned that before. And who knows what that means,
Write
if
the
that's
outline
tethered to
then.
something like Harry Potter or some other thing. Yeah, I probably will. Maybe I will, Mike. But the one thing that if you're looking at just different fictitious examples of like magic use and things like that, I prefer, as much as I like the Harry Potter stories, I'm not a fan of Harry Potter style magic, which is basically the
It's
silliest kind of
mechanical,
magic
basically.
and the
It's
kind of
technology. You just replace it with
derogatory.
technology.
It's technology, and it's like silly technology, right? It's like these funny words make this happen kind of thing. Whereas magic that I think is truer to the kind of mystery or enchantment or whatever that we find in real life is something that would be technically defined as a kind of oh, what's the type of magic? I need to go back to my Dungeons and Dragons rule book. But the type of magic that's rooted in like physical objects and actually
More intrinsic than
ritual.
extrinsic.
Yeah, well, it's this ritual magic and uh magic related to objects and things like that. These are a closer analogy to what we actually believe in, which is to say sacrament. The idea that God works through creation.
yeah, basically like what this is all sort of revolved around, why we've wanted to do this topic. It's not just because you got two wife guys who are simping, about marriage and the nature of marriage.
Speak for yourself, Mike.
Well, okay, no, I'm not saying.
I'm gonna get major brownie points with the missus.
Look, that can be an accidental consequence. I'm going to welcome that, certainly, but
quote unquote accidental.
Yeah. So, like we've both been saying, marriage is not supposed to be this human construct. It's something that it proceeds from the very nature of God as a God of relationship, as a Trinitarian relationship. And so when we talk about, God of the Old Testament seeing Israel, wanting to woo Israel in the desert away from the gods of the Egyptians as a bride, or Jesus calling himself the bridegroom and the church the bride, or St. Paul telling husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church, saying that he was the model first, and then we've all done it since. Not just, and really, even though obviously Jesus showed up at one particular time 2,000 years ago, he's been the model from all creation, right? He's been, just like he was the model of sacrifice. We kind of talked about that in the scapegoat episode.
Yeah, we talked about that.
He was the model of sacrificial love even before there were physical sacrifices. He was the model of marital love even before there was marriage. And so St. Paul makes that reference in Ephesians chapter 5, but then it all comes to a fulfillment in the book of Revelation, where the Lamb is greeted by, the church adorned as a bride, and it's the wedding feast, the wedding supper that Jesus had long alluded to throughout his ministry as well.
Oh yeah, this idea, it's funny, evidently there was a little kerfluffle in the evangelical world. There was a pastor at a church that talked about sex as a symbol of Christ and his church. And that scandalized people. And it's like, have you guys read the Bible? I mean, do you know what bride and bridegroom is implying?
Like what what sets that relationship apart?
It's not just a nice, we're talking about like pretty, pretty real physical things.
And it speaks to the, when people see love just in terms of emotions, that can be one of the issues with it, right? Is that it separates itself from the incarnational, right? The embodied actions.
And it's weird. There's layers to, it's like an onion to this concept, because
marriage is like an onion. That's the quote. Put that on the t-shirt.
Marriage is like an onion. It makes you cry. But tears of joy, babe.
Yeah.
But no, like there's the physical reality of marriage.
Good thing our wives don't listen to this podcast, right?
I know. It's just for me. But there's also, people have lost the sense that it is symbolic, right? In this deep sense of symbolism that we're talking about, in this true sense of symbolism that we're talking about, that it's meant to, if you no longer perceive marriage as an icon of Christ in the world, then it's no wonder that we've fallen into lots of confusion about the nature of marriage. And I would argue this isn't just a religious, like a Christian religious belief.
No, it's human. It's very much, it was human before it was Christian.
Yes, absolutely. That it is, it's not just this thing. We have a hard time understanding marriage, like arranged marriages back in the day. It's very offensive to our sensibilities. It's, every single fairy tale from like Disney in the last 100 years is a rejection of arranged marriages and things like that. And I'll be the first to admit that I was like that for a long, long time too. And then I was married for 15 years, and suddenly it's like, oh, arranged marriages make sense to me now. But like I didn't know we were going down this. I know. No.
I'm gonna watch you careen down this path. Go ahead.
Arranged. It's because back in the day, people understood that marriage was not just about the feels.
Okay.
And I know that we like marriage to be about the feels, and a healthy marriage should have the feels. I am not saying that we need to go back to arranged marriages. Mike is no. But what I'm pointing out to is people are very offended by the concept of arranged marriages. But arranged marriages, not only do they still persist in cultures all over the world, but they were like a normative reality for most of human history. And so the question is, why? Like, what? Isn't that weird? Isn't it weird that most humans were A-okay with this idea of arranged marriages um, at a cultural level? It's because marriage is not just when a guy and a girl like each other and decide to try to make this, work or something like that. It's this they're going to participate in a cosmic reality. And that cosmic reality is not incumbent upon it's like, again, it's like ritual magic. Like you're bringing the two people together and you're performing the act for the rest of your life.
And to go back to, because you're talking a little bit about magic, and we're sort of like, I wasn't redirecting, but saying like, we'll definitely talk more about magic as such and the kind of comparison of how it's used in stories and stuff. But if you see it in terms of going back to our idea of symbol that you brought up before, and how not only are the persons symbols, right, in the sense that not as a replacement for real, but the thing that bonds, well, the bond is, or the visible sign of that bond is that ring, right? And so that's why rings and religio and bonding, it's not just binding the people together, but why is it a sacrament in the ancient traditions, the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, is because religio doesn't just bind people together. It's not just a community thing where, we all agree on this list of teachings or on these list of practices. It's because we're being bound to God. And that's what the sacraments, you mentioned theosis before too, right? It binds us to the nature of God, which is what the sacraments, it's receiving the divine nature. It's becoming like God. And so there again, the ring, seeing that encapsulated in the ring that you wear, or just going back to all those different stories, right? Ring as that symbol for binding. And same thing with religion, right? Religion or religio as binding, not only the people in the community, but binding us to God too.
Mm-hmm. Well said, Mike. Well said.
So,
well, have you picked out your spouse for? Do you have daughters?
I have one.
Yeah. So have you picked out her spouse yet?
We're still in the discernment process. We're trying to include her as much as possible. So,
how old is she? I have a few boys.
She's in 4K.
Okay.
I don't know. We'll talk about that separately.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Sounds good.
You can come by sometime and see which one shows the most promise.
Do you remember in The Office when it was like the courtship thing where you like give them some like bones and then they step on them or something? Do you remember that when Dwight does that for the?
I don't remember that off the top of my head.
So yeah. Anyway, as you can tell, as we start to meander, that's our perfect time to thank you guys for.
Yeah, let's put a bow on this. Let's wrap this up with a nice little bow. A nice little hand fast.
So thank you guys for coming to listen to Jacob and I talk even more. This time, with the rings in the Green Lantern and how that kind of ties together with what we were talking about with part 1 of our conversation. I just want to encourage you guys again to like the podcast, subscribe, leave a 5-star positive review that gets us out there, and then it can, make Jacob's wife proud of him for dedicating all this time to hanging out with us. So
be like your Auntie Beyonce. Go put a ring on it.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.